Yeah, I mean, it was a huge propaganda victory for the Germans. It showed that they could repel with ease a British attack. The fact that there were Americans, Canadians, Brits, it was a kind of multi-allied effort, were all added to the propaganda value of the thing. But the Germans put out uh, a report, their analysis of what had happened. And the kind of key line was, this was contrary to all military common sense. And I think that's actually got a bad description of it.
An excerpt from today's guest, who's written a book about the failure of a major Allied amphibious assault prior to D-Day in World War II. Sunday Times best-selling author Patrick Bishop is here, and I'll speak with him after this break. This is Point of the Spear. I'm Robert Child, and I'd love for you to join me on my brand new podcast, Stories of Faith and Courage. In gripping narratives, we'll walk alongside ancient heroes who faced down giants, conquering adversity, and hear tales of modern-day warriors whose unwavering faith sustained them through the darkest of times. Plus, we'll explore enigmatic ancient mysteries like the connection of the Shroud of Turin to the Knights Templar that will leave you on the edge of your seat. I hope you'll join me on Stories of Faith and Courage. It's available now on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome back. I'm Robert Child. Today's guest spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent covering conflicts around the world. He is the author of two hugely acclaimed books about the Royal Air Force in the Second World War and is a Sunday Times best-selling author. His latest book is called Operation Jubilee, Dieppe 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. And Patrick Bishop joins us now. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's an honor. This military operation is known, I know, in Canada very well because I did a World War I film up there. For the British in the summer of 1942, they were getting pressure from the Russians and somewhat from the Americans to press the war forward. Can you expand on that?
Sure, yeah, it's a kind of interesting point in the British war because there's a sort of hiatus at this point. Nothing very much is happening in land terms. You've got a war going on in North Africa, which goes backwards and forwards. There isn't a resolution in sight there. There's absolutely no prospect of any major action in Europe because after the calamity of Dunkirk, everything has been concentrated on training prior to the big invasion, which the British want to be sometime in the kind of medium future. And the Americans and the Russians want to happen pretty much immediately. That's a very unrealistic aspiration on the part of the Americans. But the British find themselves in a very tricky situation. They've been begging the Americans to come into the war on their side. But when that actually happens, they're now confronted with, although they're feeling tremendous relief, they're also confronted with a new reality, which is that they're now going to have to deal with partners, listen to what they say, take their wishes into account. And as the war progresses and the imbalance in resources becomes clearer and clearer, the actual roles are reversed, and it's the British who have to listen to the Americans, not the other way around. At this stage of the war, the British still feel confident they can treat the Americans with a certain amount of condescension and tell them, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, we've been fighting a war. The fact they've been losing, it doesn't stop them from dictating their views to the Americans. So, but the fact remains that they've got to do something. You know, you've got Joe Stalin in Moscow saying, when are you going to open up this second front we've been begging for? They're on their knees at the moment. It's kind of beginning of the new campaigning season has begun. Everything's going backwards for the Russians, so they need all the help they can get. And a diversion in Europe, they hope, would actually lessen the pressure the Germans would have to divert forces away from the Eastern Front to confront it. So it's really a very political scenario that the British are facing. And I think the Dieppe Raid has to be seen primarily as a political/propaganda effort.
I got that sense from your book. The Canadians bore the brunt of the casualties in the assault, and they were really the sacrifice, referring to your title in Dieppe. Why did the Canadians play such a major role in the assault?
Well, the Canadians have been in Britain since the end of 1939, Canadian troops started arriving pretty much immediately. And they've been sitting there since then, really with nothing very much to do. Moves to send them to North Africa have been vetoed for political reasons. And so they were doing endless training exercises, getting rather bored and frustrated. I'm not saying there is an argument that says, oh, they were yearning for action. As someone who's been around soldiers a lot, who's been in many wars myself, soldiers don't yearn for action. I think what they want to do is get the thing over with and go home. So I think it was sort of presented in a rather inaccurate, distorted light, the idea that there was a lot of pressure on the British to use the Canadians because they were thirsting to get into the thick of battle. I think there's a certain amount of truth in the claim that their commanders were. So you've got these two Canadian commanders of virtually pretty much equal seniority, Crerar and Norton. And I think they wanted to kind of prove to the Brits that the Canadians were up for it, that their troops were good enough for it. And it's a continuation of a colonial story and a further chapter in the slightly odd relationship between Canada and Britain. In the First World War, the Canadians were a tremendous asset on the Western Front of the British, right. And they were prepared to take on tasks which were, off to us now, look kind of semi-suicidal. The attack on Vimy Ridge, the Battle of Passchendaele, and they suffered terribly. They fought very, very bravely. They were pretty well led. And so they'd already done their bit in the First World War. So you'd imagine that come the Second World War, after an interwar period in which people naturally think, what was that all about? What did we get out of it? Why are we fighting Britain's wars for it? They do actually kind of revert to this rather kind of, father-son attitude towards the empire. And once again, their commanders are saying, no, our guys are up for it. If you want us to do something, we'll do it. So the troops are being really pushed forward by their own commanders rather than pushing themselves forward, I would say. It suits the Brits because the obvious area to launch the attack from is southeast England. It's right opposite Dieppe. So that's where most of the Canadian troops were stationed at that time under the command of Bernard Montgomery, who at this stage hasn't become the Montgomery we all know and remember, but he's still just another British Army general, albeit a rather kind of controversial one and rather a good one because he's very good at training. He understands the importance of training. So he's in at the beginning of the enterprise, and he selects the Canadians himself, even though he subsequently didn't. There's a lot of claim and counterclaim in the story because, like any disaster, no one wants their fingerprints on it. I say in the book that if it had been a victory, it would have been a different matter. And the old story the old saying that victory has many fathers, but defeat is an orphan is particularly true in this case.
Now, MacNaughton, is that the same MacNaughton who was Arthur Curry's artillery commander?
That's right, yeah. Curry was obviously a huge figure in the First World War, but nor was a very interesting man. He was a scientist, really, by upbringing and outlook. And he did bring some new science to the art of bombardment in the First World War, which had considerably important effects, at Vimy Ridge and other places like that. So, but it's interesting that someone like that who's an intellectual, he's distinguished in his own right as a scientist as well as a soldier, and that sort of thing made British High Command uneasy. It's basically a caste, the military in Britain, both the Navy and the Army, not so much the Air Force, and so they're not impressed by the fact that MacNaughton has other strings to his bow. They see him as a kind of colonial, bit of an upstart, and it's interesting in their own correspondence among themselves that they rather look down on the Canadians.
Yeah, I got that from my World War I film that I turned into a book that they developed the fire and maneuver tactics on the Western Front. And the attitude of the British towards the Canadians, even when they pressed the attack in the last 100 days, what was poignant to me was they made them march at the end of the line.
Yeah, no, it's astonishing the condescension that they, even at this new war, they were showing towards Dominion troops, Australians and Canadians. I think they were a bit more wary of the Australians, but it's really interesting comparing the attitude towards the colonial troops, if we can call them that, and commanders, and the Americans, because even though they're behind the Americans' backs, they kind of being quite rude about them. To their faces, they're fantastically deferential, fawning on them. And I make a little analogy. It's like, when they come to Britain, when Marshall comes to Britain to discuss with his team to discuss how the war is going to be taken forward, the British understand perfectly well. We really, really, really need these guys. We've got to keep them on side. But privately, they're saying they don't know the first thing about how to wage a war yet. They roll out the red carpet, and I say it's like, the maitre d' in a fancy hotel, welcoming these vulgar, high-rolling guests, because they're going to be spending the money, but secretly despising them behind their back. That's the attitude. But it's interesting that it's not so well known in America, because this is the first time American troops take part in battle in Western Europe. So there is a contingent of Rangers who are trained by the Commando Training Centre in Scotland, right, and then distributed among some of the units taking part in the assault. And they actually go ashore on the 19th of August and are in the thick of several battles.
I'm trying to remember the casualty numbers. Weren't 7 killed?
That's right, yeah. The first American to die in Europe was killed on Yellow Beach. His name was Edwin Lucelot. It's one of those sort of tragedies of when you're reporting or rather writing about these histories. You get this little smudge photograph of some young, handsome guy that you know virtually nothing about. It's very, very hard to find out anything about him. He was just a volunteer who clearly was brave, resourceful. As far as we can tell, the guys he came in contact with on the British side thought a lot of him. But his life, boom, it's gone, without leaving any real trace.
It's really a privilege to be involved with a documentary about the USS Franklin. And the Franklin was something that I'd always been fascinated by. And then producer Joe Small and producer-director Rob Childs come to me and say, look, how about if you use your dulcet tones to tell the Franklin story? So as I began to look through the story, and as Rob and Joe kept sending me more and more material, this thing was peeling like an onion. I was seeing more and more and more of a really, really important story in naval history, and one which hadn't been told. So they had to throw a 2-inch heaving line on me to keep me from charging right down here to the studio and helping to put this together.
Captain Dale Dye narrates USS Franklin, Honor Restored. Available now on Amazon Prime. In your book, there's some comparison to Passchendaele in World War I, the futility of it. What do you think the factors were that contributed mainly to the failure of the operation?
Well, it was really a absurdly ambitious plan. The idea that you could throw troops straight at these heavily defended positions and expect them to prevail, even though they were supported by tanks. This is the first time that tanks are used in an amphibious operation. It was absurd, and it was kind of obvious to everyone taking part that the potential for a massacre was there. They had good intelligence from numerous aerial reconnaissance sorties that gave them a pretty good idea of where the guns were and the scale of the defenses. Yet nonetheless, against all kind of military logic, they decided on this frontal assault. Why would they do that? Well, I think the answer is that the political pressures to do something were great, and then they were supplemented by the vanity of the man who really bears most responsibility for the whole operation, which is Lord Louis Mountbatten. He was the commander of the Combined Operations, which was the organization that was charged with mounting these cross-channel raids, amphibious operations into occupied Europe. And after one has to remember that the operation was actually stood down on its first attempt, which was in July 1942, because the weather was atrocious. Everyone was packed in the ships, all ready to go, and then the weather intervened and it was called off. Now, mounting an operation like that is a big event. It's very visible. And so the expectation was, this is now over. It's been cancelled for all time because the Germans will surely get to learn about it. And if they get to learn about it, they'll think, oh, well, they'll probably do it again. Mountbatten was very cast down because he thought this was another vehicle for his march towards glory and eternal fame. And so he was the one agitating to get it remounted. And his argument was, well, because the Germans expect us to come, I got this the wrong way around. They will now think they wouldn't be as mad as to do this again, having done it, attempted it once, called it off. It would be insane for them to come again. So we're going to actually do the counter-logical thing and relaunch the attack. Amazingly, this extraordinary bit of logic was swallowed by Churchill and the chiefs of staff.
It's like
and so off it went.
Almost.
Yeah, but it's, you don't gamble with people's lives like that on a kind of, on a sort of reading of the completely sort of fanciful reading of the German mind.
And Mountbatten tried to paint the failure of the operation in the best possible light, didn't he, after the battle?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens with a disaster on this scale is that it's in everyone's interest to present it in a good light, because everyone bears everyone at the higher levels, militarily and politically, bears some responsibility or can be accused of bearing some responsibility. So they all want to say, okay, it might look terrible, but there was actually some higher purpose to it. And as Mountbatten was the one who most fingers will be pointing at, he was the one that constructed the argument that this was not just a kind of pointless smash and grab raid on a heavily occupied port. It was a kind of military experiment, and that the point was to learn lessons about how to launch a cross-channel, a large amphibious invasion that would then be applied when D-Day finally came. And he said this continuously right from the day of the raid really onwards until the last day of his life. And a lot of people have swallowed it. And it's often said, D-Day or Dieppe, of course, that was a preparation for D-Day. All the books and articles that came out about it afterwards have some reference to rehearsal for D-Day, etc. Yeah. Now, I think if that was true, then there would have been in the orders are very voluminous, some reference to how this raid is going to be a learning process, a learning exercise, and that the commanders would be issued with some sort of questionnaires and things like this, which could then be measured afterwards to actually quantify the lessons learned, the metrics of the whole operation. But there's nothing there at all that suggests that this was the case. So my belief is that it was a raid that for all sorts of, and in wartime things go wrong all the time, but in wartime you get all these kind of dynamics coming together to create a sort of unstoppable force, some of it political, like I've said, and diplomatic, some of it the egos of the people involved, and some of it just, things reach a certain sort of point where it's easier just to go on than it is to pull back. So I think all that's in there. But Mountbatten, being the vain man he was, couldn't bear to think that his name would be associated with an utter failure. And I think that's why all his energy and considerable kind of charm, ability to get people to see things his way, went into repainting the picture of Dieppe.
And didn't he survey some of the veterans years after the battle for their comments that basically supported his contention that it was a
Yeah, I mean, there were several reports were written down the years. They were still writing reports as late as late 1950s. And before each one, each new kind of account came out, he would go around the people who'd been his lieutenants in the organization and say, look, they're writing a new report. As I recall, it was like this, wasn't it? And they all dutifully sort of saluted and said, yes, I think you're absolutely right, sir. I think your memory of that is completely accurate.
Absolutely.
One guy did pipe up and say, I didn't quite remember that. But he was, his views were not included in the report they put in.
Now, the failure of the attack, did it instill increased confidence in the Germans?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge propaganda victory for the Germans. It showed that they could repel with ease a British attack. The fact that there were Americans, Canadians, Brits, it was a kind of multi-allied effort, all added to the propaganda value of the thing. And it also was quite good from their propaganda position vis-a-vis the French citizens, the French occupied population, because they could say, look, your so-called friends across the channel, look, they come to your town, they smash it up, and then they're utterly defeated and they go away again. So much for General de Gaulle and all his sort of pompous utterings from London. So it was great. They loved it, and they made it, as you can imagine, they absolutely made a meal of it right across the occupied territories.
Did Hitler have a comment that you can recall after the defeat of the Allied attack?
I don't think he's on record as saying anything directly, but the Germans put out a report, their analysis of what had happened. And the kind of key line was, this was contrary to all military common sense. And I think that's actually not a bad description of it.
Are you working on another World War II book, or what are some of the projects on your plate these days?
Well, I'm currently making a documentary about the Falklands War, 40 years on. I know Americans don't remember much about the Falklands War, but it was a big deal for us. It was a kind of very Second World War type operation when the Falkland Islands, which most British people didn't know where they were, or indeed that they belonged to Britain, were invaded by the Argentinians in the spring of 1940. Oh, sorry, I'm going to get my centuries or decades right. 1982. And we sent a task force 8,000 miles of Marines, paras, and infantrymen. And it was an astonishing feat of arms. We managed to seize Islands back. I was there myself as a young reporter, so it's ringing lots of kind of nostalgic bells for me. Looking back, it really was a very close-run thing. I mean, it was probably the last time we were able to mount an operation of that nature with the resources we had. We've got nothing like the resources to do that now, so it feels like a different Britain. I'm also writing a book. I've just started a book called Research on a book about the liberation of Paris, where I'm trying to tell the story of those days in August 1944 through the eyes of a sort of 15 participants from different sides of the story, including some kind of famous people like J.D. Salinger, who was an infantryman with 4th Infantry Division, who went into the city in the first days, but also kind of people who no one's ever heard of, who try and illustrate the kind of drama of the thing, but also the symbolism.
Getting back to the Falklands War, I'm just curious, because as an American, I did hear about the war. I remember it. I was in college at the time. What was the strategic objective of the attack? I think that's what Americans may not understand.
Yeah, well, there wasn't really a strategic objective, and indeed the army were pretty reluctant to endorse it, because their view was, look, it doesn't actually mean anything. These islands are right on the other side of the world. They don't have any strategic value in terms of geopolitical value. There are no resources there. There was believed to be oil, but it was going to be very expensive to lift it, which remains the case today. Yeah. It was a war about principle and a war about face. It was about first of all, defending the principle that the people of the Falkland Islands feel themselves to be utterly British. If you ever went there, you would imagine that they are like Britons who've just been stranded on some very remote islands on the opposite side of the world to Britain itself. And they have the slightest desire to be absorbed into Argentina, despite Argentina's claims that it was Argentinian territory. If you look at the history, it's very confused, and really the only thing that you can use to measure the justice of ownership is what do the people on the islands actually want, and they too, a man, a woman, a child, they wanted it to stay British. So that was a principle that was accepted across the political spectrum in Britain. Even the very leftist Labour opposition leader, who was a CND member against nuclear weapons, and generally of a sort of not pacifist but pacific bent, he stood up in the House and said, no, we've got to go to war. We can't. This is a sacred principle that can't be violated. But the strategic value, practically nil, which remains the case today. But the symbolic value and what the signal it will send to the world about Britain's place in the pecking order, if we just meekly rolled over and allowed this tin pot dictatorship to hold on to the islands, I think was very, very important.
I see. The book is called Operation Jubilee, Dieppe, 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice, and I highly recommend it. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. This was very enjoyable.
It was a pleasure, Rob. Thanks very much for having me.
That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me. And if you like what you hear, leave a review or a rating, or just click the follow button. And be sure to check out our Point of the Spear YouTube channel with bonus video material plus full military history documentaries. There's tons to explore, and I hope you check it out. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.